Okay, so Mrs. Wright just says somebody slipped a rope around his neck and strangled him. And or that's what the sheriff was sort of questioning, or her neighbor was questioning her about, that they found a rope around his neck and that he was strangled to death, and she didn't know how to explain it. So they see, her as a suspect, obviously, because she's sort of in this almost state of shock, and she seems very nervous and pleating her apron. And then what's her excuse? She slept through the murder of her husband, or she can't explain his death. Then Mr. Hale recalls another conversation he had with John Wright's wife, and he says he tried to make conversation with her after she just explained her husband's death. And he says, I had to come to see if John wanted to put in a telephone, and at that she started to laugh. And then she stopped and looked at me scared. So her reaction is kind of interesting there around the telephone. So that the telephone seems to be a point of conflict for the Wright in their marriage. She would have liked a telephone, or her husband does not want a telephone, and she kind of just laughs as if, John Wright would never want a telephone, like that's something ridiculous or unheard of. And then she kind of looks scared about maybe what's to come, or that was her reaction to her husband. So that's still a kind of a mystery of like the full dynamics of their relationship and why he was murdered and why she murdered him. But we'll find more clues as the story goes on. And the men in the room, again, they say they're more interested in they want to find some evidence that will prove that she murdered him. And they say, well, let's go upstairs first, then out to the barn around there. There's nothing really important here. So they're meaning nothing here but kitchen things. So kitchen things here is kind of a way of talking about women's space in this, in the domestic sphere or private sphere, where women were constrained by those gender roles. But men are very dismissive of it, right? This is just kitchen things, women's stuff. It's not important to the case. But they're very dismissive, and they're going to overlook a lot of the clues that the women in the room actually can see. So one of the first objects that they notice in the kitchen is that one of the jars that Mrs. Wright canned had exploded. So her fruit that she had preserved and put in a can froze, and then the pressure kind of built up, and it can crack the jar and create quite a big mess. And the women are all very sympathetic. Oh, her fruit, it did freeze. She worried about that when it turned so cold. She would have worried about her jars breaking. And then the men are, again, very dismissive. The sheriff says, well, can't you beat that, women held for murder and worrying about her preserves? So it's, again, very dismissive of women's work, the effort they put into, canning and preserving food, all of these things that, again, women take a lot of pride in. And that was their, livelihood, their way of life. And then we have a quote from Hale, the neighbor. Women are used to worrying over trifles. So he's talking about the jar of preserves that has been ruined. And he's really, again, also stereotyping women as concerned with trifling things and unimportant things, little trifles, things that are not consequential to important or serious business of men's work. They're just little trifles, little insignificant things. So that's kind of where we get the title of the story, that women's lives are made up or concerned with insignificant things, and men don't really see the significance or the importance of those things. And yet it's it's going to be the whole basis of why or how we understand Mrs. Wright's suffering within her marriage. And then as the men kind of walk around the house a little bit, they also criticize Mrs. Wright's kitchen and the cleanliness of it. So the attorney says, for all their worries, what would we do without ladies? And then comments on the dirty towels. Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies? So he's kind of insulting Mrs. Wright as being a poor housekeeper for keeping a kitchen that has dirty towels in it. And he's also acknowledging that's why men depend on women, is for the cooking and cleaning and those kinds of trifling behaviors, or, the insignificant things in life. The women are a little bit more sympathetic, and Mrs. Hale stiffly says there's a great deal of work to be done on a farm. So she acknowledges that women's work on the farm in these remote farmsteads is actually very difficult, and the jobs are never done, right? You have one task after another and you're always working. So it's not just dirty towels and a dirty sink. It's, preserving and all of these, duties that come one after another, not even including childcare. So the men again are very dismissive, and then the women have a different kind of insight into what life was like for Mrs. Wright. And as we'll see, they're more sympathetic. Mrs. Hale says, those towels get dirty awful quick. Men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be. So she's defending, her friend, Mrs. Wright, and why she might have dirty towels. And she's sort of saying men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be. Literally, that could be meaning, men come in with dirty hands and wipe their hands on the towel. But it could also be more symbolic, like men aren't guilt-free, or men maybe are corrupt, or, they bring upon their own troubles. In a way, they aren't as clean and scot-free. They're not as innocent as in this case as it might seem. And the attorney says, you're loyal to your sex, I see. So again, he's noticing that the women are kind of standing up for Mrs. Wright in this case, defending her having dirty towels, or, a normal kitchen, basically, that's not perfect or absolutely clean. So the attorney kind of questions the women about whether they were good friends with Mrs. Wright, and Mrs. Hale's a neighbor, so she would have had a closer relationship with them. But she says that we were neighbors, but we weren't. I didn't see much of her lately. She says, I've not been in this house in more than a year, and she says, I liked her all well enough. Farmers' wives have their hands full, Mr. Henderson, and then it never seemed a very cheerful place. So she's giving another little glimpse of what she has observed about John Wright and his wife and their homestead, that it's never been a happy place, and that she liked the wife well enough, but she didn't like coming over there because of how gloomy and dreary and maybe oppressive it seemed in its atmosphere. And instead of sort of sympathizing or saying something about that, the attorney just again mentions that she wasn't a very good housekeeper based on what he's observed of the dirty towels and the jar of preserves cracking. So he's insulting her homemaking instinct. And Mrs. Hale says, well, I don't know as Wright had either. So she's again saying the husband. And then she says, I don't think a place would be any cheerfuler for John Wright's being in it, meaning sort of saying that he wasn't a very cheerful person. So before the men go back upstairs to check out the bedroom, and the women stay on the main floor near the kitchen, the sheriff and the attorney just sort of tell the women, oh, well, you can pick up a couple of her clothing or things that she might want while she's being held in prison. Um, so that's where Mrs. Wright is at the moment. She's in prison, and the women are going to get a few things together from her possessions to take to her. And then the men, the attorney says something like, yes, but I would like to see what you take, Mrs. Peters, and keep an eye out for anything that might be of use to us. So if they find anything suspicious, they're supposed to bring it to the men's attention. And that's when the men go upstairs, and then the women look about the kitchen. So again, we have the separation of sexes. Men are upstairs, women are downstairs. It's kind of a symbol of the different way that men and women, perceive the world, and in this case, perceive the marriage and the murder. So the women are left alone, and then now they're able to sort of maybe talk more freely to one another without the men in their company. And Mrs. Hale criticizes the men. She says, I'd hate to have men coming into my kitchen snooping around and criticizing. And then Mrs. Peters kind of defends the men and says, well, it's their duty. And then Mrs. Hale says, it seems mean to talk about her for not having things slicked up when she had to come away in such a hurry. And she also sympathizes with Mrs. Wright for her fruit being, wasted with the jar cracking. So they have sympathy for Mrs. Wright, even though it's clear she probably, did complete this murder. So maybe they have a little bit more sympathy for just how difficult she had it in this environment. The cracked jar itself could be a symbol. So things under pressure, or if it gets too cold, the jar cracks or shatters. So that could be kind of a symbol of maybe her life being under pressure, under an environment of oppression, and finally cracking or bursting. So a kind of metaphor for her mental health, living under the oppression of John Wright as her husband. She comments on how cold it is. So maybe again, an observation of the environment that she lived in. And then she, examining the skirt, says, Wright was close. I think maybe that's why she kept so much to herself. She didn't even belong to the Ladies' Aid. I suppose she felt she couldn't do her part. And then you don't enjoy things when you feel shabby. She used to wear pretty clothes and be lively when she was Minnie Foster, one of the town girls singing in the choir. But that was 30 years ago. This all you was to take. She also wanted her apron. So there's a little bit of backstory there. So before she was John Wright's wife, her name was Minnie Foster, and she used to sing in a girls' choir. So this was 30 years ago when she was a young unmarried woman. And then she got married to Mr. John Wright and became Mrs. Wright. So you kind of, as a woman, lose your sense of self when you marry and you become a wife to a man. You take his last name and you become Mrs. So-and-so, right? So you kind of lose your sense of independence and the things that, made you a unique individual. She used to wear pretty clothes and be lively, but it seems as if recently in her life she closed off, was more isolated from other women. She didn't even belong to the Ladies' Aid organization, so there's some women's organization that she didn't belong to. And it seems as if she kind of felt maybe had poor self-esteem because of her poor clothing, or they couldn't afford nice things in her household, or maybe her husband didn't let her have nice things. So she really kind of was very isolated from the other women in this community. So as they're kind of getting a few items together for her shawl, her apron, things like that, they also kind of speculate. One woman, Mrs. Peters, asks, do you think she did it? Mrs. Hale said, oh, I don't know. And then they're kind of going back and forth in terms of whether or not they think she's capable of doing it. She seems like such a nice little old lady. How could she be capable of murdering her husband? And then Mrs. Peters says, it looks bad for her. And that John Wright didn't wake up when they was slipping that rope under his neck. And how odd his death was, that there was a noose around his neck, and then when he got up, it kind of tightened, and he hung himself with this knot around his neck. So it's kind of an unusual circumstance around a death, a murder. And she kind of contemplates that, it's interesting because there was a gun in the house, but the murder was done with a piece of rope that was tied around his neck. So that's one of the things the men are out there for, she says, was they need a motive, something to show anger or sudden feeling. So what caused this, murder? What caused this breakdown of their marriage? So as the women look around the house a little bit more, they see a piece of quilt in a large sewing basket, and they're just observing the nice quilt pieces. And she says, Mrs. Hale says, I wonder if she was going to quilt or just knot it. And then the men come downstairs there and kind of laugh at the women who are contemplating these little squares of quilted material. But the question about knotting a quilt, so a specific type of quilt is the ones where you sort of have layers of material and then you kind of use yarn or something to create little knots holding all the pieces of the quilting together. So knotting the quilt and John Wright's death by a knot around his throat with the rope, you should be sort of connecting those two things. So it's another little glimpse or hint of the trifles that the men are overlooking and the women are paying attention to. And then Mrs. Peters looks at another piece of quilting, and then she says, here, or Mrs. Hale says, here, look at this one she was working on, and look at all the sewing. All the rest of it has been so nice and even, and look at this, it's all over the place. Why, it looks as if she didn't know what she was about. After an instant, Mrs. Hale had just pulled at a knot and ripped the sewing. So she's kind of fidgeting with the quilted piece that's not sewed very well, and undoing the poorly quilted piece. But in a way, she's kind of tampering with evidence as well, right? Because this little quilt piece gives us another little clue as to what Minnie Wright's, what her mindset was like in the days leading up to her murder of her husband. So she was once quilting very nicely, and then it gets all erratic and all over the place. So it tells us something about her state of mind, that something had triggered her, and she's dealing with this unrest. And then here's Mrs. Hale kind of undoing that evidence. She doesn't really acknowledge that that's what she's doing, but by fiddling with her fingers on the thread and undoing it, she is kind of tampering with evidence. But it's evidence that the men don't really care about, right? It's just the trifles of women's work. And they observe that maybe if a woman would start sewing like that if she was nervous. And then Mrs. Peters says, I sometimes sew awful queer when I'm just tired, or, when you're nervous about something. So it seems as if they understand partly what this woman was going through, that she was either in a state of nervousness or exhausted or something like that. They go around looking for a piece of paper and string, look in the cupboard, and they find a bird cage. And that's another little clue or trifle. So a bird cage could be a symbol for Mrs. Wright in this case. And we learned that, you know, there was a man who came around sometime not long ago who sold canaries for cheap. And then maybe she had bought one. It's also observed here by Mrs. Hale that she used to sing real pretty herself. So maybe she, like the canary, you know, she loved canaries and their ability to sing, and maybe she wanted something beautiful for herself. So it seems like she once had this bird cage with a bird in it. And she notices that the cage has a broken door, the hinge is pulled off, and then it looks as if someone had been rough with it. So someone who manhandled the bird cage, ripped off the door. But it's maybe something, you know, again, a symbol of something in related to their marriage. And again, they're contemplating things, the atmosphere. Mrs. Hale says, I wish they're going to find any evidence they'd be about it. I don't like this place. And Mrs. Peters says, I'm awfully glad you came with me, Mrs. Hale. It would be lonesome of me sitting here alone. Mrs. Hale feels some guilt. She says, I do wish, Miss Peters, I wish I had come over here sometimes when she was here. So she kind of feels regrets about maybe not visiting more often to Minnie Wright's house, maybe growing in sympathy for her about what her life was actually like. The birdcage gives us an indication of maybe Minnie Wright felt caged herself in her marriage, that she felt oppressed or imprisoned, and she had no way out. Mrs. Hale observes, I could have come. I stayed away because it weren't cheerful, and that's why I ought to have come. I've never liked this place, maybe because it's down in a hollow and you don't see the road. I don't know what it is, but it's a lonesome place and always was. I wish I had come over to see Minnie Foster sometimes. I can see now. So she kind of sees now, right? She sees that her friend or this woman was lonely, isolated, unhappy, and that John Wright was not a good man. And then she, in this case, says, not having children makes less work, but it makes a quiet house. And Wright out to work all the day and no company when he did come in. So again, she acknowledges that, yeah, they didn't have children, but it was a quiet house, and Mrs. Minnie Wright didn't have a lot of connections to the outside world. Mrs. Hale acknowledges Mr. Wright was a hard man, just to pass the time of day with him, like a raw wind that gets to the bone. I should think she would have wanted a bird, but what do you suppose went with it? So she is characterizing John Wright as a hard man, a cold man, like a raw wind. So it kind of insinuates that he could be abusive or cold and unfeeling. And then she also observes, come to think of it, so Minnie Wright was kind of a bird herself, real sweet and pretty, but kind of timid and fluttery. How she did change. So again, acknowledging that Minnie Wright, like a bird herself, was perhaps caged in this marriage to John Wright. They decided to take some of her quilting things to her in jail. So they're going to give her some sewing to do if she's bored. Then they open up a box, and it's the dead canary that they were contemplating. So yes, she had a bird at one point, and now they found the dead bird that would have gone in the cage. And they see that the bird's neck, look at its neck. Somebody wrung its neck. Their eyes meet, a look of growing comprehension of horror. Steps are heard outside. Mrs. Hale slips box under quilt pieces and sinks into her chair. So she kind of puts the bird away and hides it under the quilt pieces. And they have this moment of recognition, a growing comprehension of horror as their eyes meet over the acknowledgement that this canary had died by having its neck wrung. And that's the same way that John Wright died, right? He had a rope around his neck and his neck broke. So it does tell us, I think, that perhaps this was a murder based on revenge, that the husband killed the bird and then Minnie Wright killed the husband. The bird is also a representation of her. So when the husband killed the bird, she maybe also felt like he's murdered a part of her life, her joy. And so I think it is a murder of revenge against her husband and what he committed when he killed her precious pet canary. So that's kind of the motive, the triggering event. At least that's what my interpretation of the story is. And yeah, then the men come down from upstairs and they question the ladies and just say, well, have you decided whether she was going to quilt it or knot it? And then she says she was going to knot it. And then they look at the bird cage and they ask, has the bird flown? And then the ladies say, we think the cat got it. So they're lying to the men by saying, there's no bird body, right? They've hidden the evidence. So the women are kind of protective, sympathetic towards Minnie Wright, and they're going to hold back what they truly think happened from the men there. And just the stage directions, the two women sit there not looking at one another, but as if peering into something and at the same time holding back. When they talk now, it is the manner of feeling their way over strange ground, as if afraid of what they are saying, but as if they cannot help saying it. The men have now returned upstairs, and then the women are talking alone again as they contemplate what they've recognized, this moment of recognition that they have had. And so Mrs. Hale says she liked the bird. She was going to bury it in a pretty box. And then Mrs. Peters talks about when she was a little girl, she had a kitten and there was a boy who killed it. And she said it took everything inside of her to not hurt him back as revenge. So she kind of understands and sympathizes with Mrs. Wright for the loss of the animal that she thought was precious to her, that her husband destroyed. And they associate the bird again with Minnie Wright. They say Wright wouldn't like the bird, a thing that sang, right? He was a guy all about peace and quiet, and here was a bird, something that belonged to his wife, that made noise, that was lively, that sang beautifully. And then she says she used to sing, he killed that too. Mrs. Hale answers the question. So we don't know who killed the bird. She says, I knew John Wright. His neck choked the life out of him. So she acknowledges that John Wright was the one to kill the bird. And this was all kind of a revenge. So the two women have kind of pieced together what happened, but the men are still kind of clueless because they're not paying attention to the trifles of women's work. Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters both kind of have sympathy now for their friend Miss Minnie Wright, or the woman who they would have wanted to help out if they could have, or if they knew what was going on. Miss Peters says, I know what stillness is, what silence is, what oppression is. And then Miss Hale says, I wish you'd seen Minnie Foster when she wore a white dress with blue ribbons and sang up there in the choir. Oh, I wish I'd come over here once in a while. That was crime. That was a crime. Who's going to punish that? So she's saying it's a crime that the husband suppressed or oppressed his wife so much that it drove her to this breaking point. And she lost who she was inside. And that's what broke her spirit and caused her to lash out at her husband, who had sort of choked the life out of her all of these years. And then Mrs. Hale says, I might have known she needed help. I know how things can be for women. I tell you, it's queer, Mrs. Peters. We live so close together and we live far apart. We all go through the same things. It's all just a different kind of the same thing. If I was to tell you, or if I was you, I wouldn't tell her her fruit was gone. Tell her it ain't. Tell her it's all right. Take this in and prove it to her. She may never know whether it was broke or not. So again, the women are very sympathetic and just want to do nice things for Minnie Wright while she's being held in prison. So the men come down again. And then the women kind of laugh it off, saying, just whispering to each other about the dead canary. And then she's sort of like, oh, if they only knew that, they would have laughed, or they would have, not acknowledged it. And yeah, so they're just sort of wrapping up in the house before they take off. The sheriff asks, do you want to see what Mrs. Peters is going to take in? And then the attorney says, oh, I guess they're not very dangerous things the ladies have picked up. No, Mrs. Peters doesn't need supervising for that matter. A sheriff's wife is married to the law. Ever think of it that way, Miss Peters? And she says, no, not that way. Married to the law. I just want you to come in here a minute, George. We ought to take a look at those windows. And then the sheriff goes on. And then at the very end here, it's just acknowledged in the stage directions. A moment, Mrs. Hale holds her, then her own eyes point the way to where the box is concealed. Suddenly, Mrs. Peter throws back quilt pieces and tries to put the box in the bag she is wearing. It is too big. She opens the box, starts to take the bird out, cannot touch it, goes to pieces, stands there helpless. Sound of a knob turning in the other room. Mrs. Hale snatches the box and puts it in the pocket of her big coat. So basically, she gets rid of the evidence of the dead bird, hiding it in her pocket so the men don't see it, and just kind of getting rid of it. So she's hiding that piece of evidence. And then the last words that are spoken, the attorney says, well, Henry, at least we found out that she was not going to quilt it. She was going to, what is it you call it, ladies? And then the ladies say, we call it not it, Mr. Henderson. So the ladies have kind of done a sort of, they've aligned themselves with Minnie Wright in this case, and they're kind of protecting her from a further charge, because had they found the canary with its wrung neck, they would have motive to prove that she was murdering with motive, which would be a higher charge or more severe charge. But without that evidence, they don't really have as strong a case. So she may still be charged with murder, but it wouldn't be the severe sentence that she could have gotten. So in a way, they're doing a little bit of solidarity, women's solidarity with their friend Minnie, and kind of protecting her in this moment. And the men are kind of oblivious to what their wife and the neighbor's wife are doing. Okay, so that's Trifles. I'll post a couple of questions where you can kind of reflect on the play and maybe add your own thoughts on some of these topics.